You just say that the landing place session tonight. Thanks. Has lots of parts for people to play. There's another play reading, so everybody's more than welcome to. We'll just sort that out at 6:30. So yes, we go on further with Brecht's The Manifesto. On liberty, equality, fraternity. What happened to it? Freedom for the bourgeois to exploit people, say the classics. Equality before the law for the rich and poor to buy palaces or to be permitted to sleep under the bridge arches. Born out of tempests that bore it to power, the bourgeoisie beholds the deadly tempests violent gather against it. For now that this class, with its new property deeds and rights, had conjured forth forces never hereto imagined, it seemed a conjurer who has lost control of the underground forces he has brought up. As rain quickens crops, but unceasing completely washes them out, so the rising creative forces multiply fortunes and powers of the class that rules, but rising still further, they endanger that self-same rule. From now on, the story of commerce and mass production tells how the forces that create the goods engage in rebellion against the bourgeois ownership and bourgeois ways to create goods. Colossal crises, recurring in cycles, similar to huge and blindly groping hands that grip and throttle commerce. Convulse in speechless rage companies, markets, and homes. Immemorial hunger had plagued the world when granaries emptied. Now, nobody knows why, we are hungry when they're too full. Mothers find nothing in the bare pantry to fill the small mouths, while sky-high mountains of grain rot behind walls, and while bales upon bales of cloth are warehoused, the ragged family, overnight kicked out of its rented home, wanders freezing through emptied city quarters. He who cursed exploiters now cannot find exploiters. Ceaseless was his work, ceaseless is now his search for work, but the gate is closed. Alas, even hell functions no longer. Where now? The giant edifice of civil society, built with so much exertion by so many sacrificed generations, sinks back into barbarism. Not the too little is threatening, the too much makes it totter. The house does not exist for dwelling, the cloth for dressing, nor the bread for stilling hunger. They must bring profit. If the product, however, is only used, but not also bought, since the producer's pay is too small, were the salary raised, it wouldn't pay to produce the commodity. Why then hire the hands? For they must produce at the workbench more than a reproduction of worker and family if there's to be profit. Yet, what then with the commodities? In good logic, therefore, woolens and grain, coffee and fruits and fish and pork, all are consumed by fire to warm the god of profit. Heaps of machines, tools for entire armies of workers, blast furnace, shipyard and mine and iron and textile mill, all sacrificed, cut up to appease the god of profit. Yet their god of profit is smitten with blindness. He never sees the victims, he's ignorant. While he counsels believers, he mumbles formulas nobody grasps. The laws of economics are revealed as the law of gravity at the time the house collapses, crashing on our heads. In panic torment, the bourgeoisie starts cutting to pieces its goods and wildly runs with the remains around the globe, searching for newer and larger markets. The plague-stricken thus flees, but only carries the plague along and infects the places of shelter. In new and larger crises, it wakes up staggered. But upon the impoverished peoples, whose multitudes the bourgeoisie is whirling around in planless plans, now thrown into saunas, now onto icy streets again, it dawns that the springtime of the bourgeois class is over. Its constricting world can't grasp the riches created.
The session title this morning for this session is Difference Between Socialism and Communism. And we welcome Peter Kennedy from talking about socialism from a Marxist point of view. Peter, yeah.
Right. Okay, yeah, it was a powerful talk there by Tam. Yeah, today, I just, is this mic on, by the way? Can you hear the back, yeah? No.
Here's the one, please.
Yeah.
It's on, or you need to put the
Oh, yeah. Looks good. Yeah. Okey doke. Can you hear that? Yeah.
Can we come right to better then?
Oops.
When he speaks, we'll let you know.
Yeah. Okay, I'm speaking now.
Better.
Great, okay. All right, today I'm going to look at differentiating between socialism and communism. And the reason why I became interested in this topic is that I wrote an article for Critique a while ago, and it was about secular decline. And it was around the time of like just after the 2008 financial crisis. And so there was lots of arguments about secular decline in the US, even right up to the US Treasury, that kind of thing. They were pontificating about the slowdown in the economy and how they hadn't quite caught up with where they were after the crash in terms of productivity, which they took a long while anyway to get back up. So, and part of the paper was looking at the reasons, and one that I came across, which I've argued for anyway, was the idea that socialism is social democracy, to be accurate, has been fundamental to the post-war boom. Nothing surprising there. And when social democracy declined and gave way to neoliberalism, then we entered a period of the financial freedom, if you like, finance capital, be more mobile, to create a global redivision of labour and capital in the period after the 1980s. And so we see growth figures begin to decline. We have like chronic spurts of growth followed by sustained, just rocking along the bottom. And these are shown in figures and data. And hence right now, all the talk about productivity growth, and the Labour Party today has made that one of its promises, which it won't be able to keep, about raising productivity and so on. So it got me wondering about like socialism, and because I've really been out of sect politics, and I've just kind of being engaged in political economy, Marxist political economy. And so I think those two things made me look at socialism, communism. And it struck me as kind of peculiar, I don't know whether I'm right or not, but that people equated the two together. So socialists on the left, sections of the left, equated the two together, communism, socialism, interchangeably. And I found that a little bit like, I was kind of skeptical about that, simply, this equation, simply because it neglected a period of transition, perhaps. If it's just socialism, okay, you might have like phases of socialism, but that's not what Marx spoke of. He spoke of communism and socialism, or communism. Communism is phases, so that got me a bit worried. And the other reason I was skeptical is because it evades discussion of development in capitalism, how it's evolved, and that it now is able to, in its decline, incorporate monstrous versions of socialism that effectively sustain decline in capitalism. I'll pick up on that later. So those two things. So just before I go forward, I'll go backwards and consider Marx and Engels. And we find when we look at Marx and Engels' work, that there's some evidence for the equation between socialism and communism. On the one hand, in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, and also, which is 1843, and Engels, Principles of Communism, 1847, then it's about communism with no mention of socialism. And the opposition, if you like, polar opposition is between private property, overturning that, and developing communism, and talk about crude communism in the economic and philosophical manuscripts to kind of like situate, in a media form, if you like, that society is kind of propelled to give shape to as capitalism develops, but nothing on socialism. When we get to the Grundrisse, then socialism and communism appear side by side. So I suppose that implies there's an equation there between the two, using them interchangingly. And when we get to Engels' scientific socialism, socialism, you're talking scientific, 1880, then we see that socialism predominates. Hence, they're suggesting again an equation. But is that the case with socialism, utopian, and scientific? Is that the case? It seems to me that Engels is referring to a society, not post-capitalism, but a science of socialization, or the capitalist mode of production, and present a materialist account in opposition to the utopian socialisms, a materialist account of the development of capitalism and its socialization with the concentration and centralization of capital, and how that provides us with a kind of a material base upon which to build, I would imagine, a workers' power to eventually develop towards communism. And if we look at Engels' writing 10 years later, then he favours communism in the preface to the 1890 reprint of the Manifesto of the Communist Party, 1847. So this is 1890, and Engels reflects, I've just kind of brought this, a long quote together, goes like this: "We could not have called this a socialist manifesto. In 1847, we're speaking of the Communist Manifesto. In 1847, two kinds of people were considered socialists. On the one hand, the adherents of the various utopian systems. On the other hand, the section of working class demanding a radical reconstruction of society called itself communist. And since we were very decidedly of the opinion that the emancipation of the workers must be the task of the working class itself, we could have no hesitation as to which of the two names we should choose. nor has it ever occurred to us to repudiate it. End of quote. So 1890, Engels comes back, having written, you know, what is it, the pamphlets that mentioned, he comes back with that quote. You know, but then again, Marx in the critique of the Gotha program, quite famously, 1875, does refer to socialism as a process towards communism, as we know, i.e. a phase from the lower socialism to the higher communism. Nevertheless, Marx often uses the terms initial or immediate communism, not socialism. Moreover, when Marx does use both socialist and communist phases, it's less clear as to whether the development he has in mind is socialism within a declining transitional capitalism, or on the other side of capitalism once workers take power. And he probably means the two. He's not clear on that. So, in a nutshell, Marx used both, but I think favoured communism more than socialism for how he defined the future society. So what? You know, so what? Okay. So we might think to ourselves, yeah, okay, what does that mean right now? Well, I think, you know, the crucial point is this: the development of capitalism and class struggle after Marx has effectively opened the chasm between socialism and communism, ideological material, which problematizes the use we make of socialism and communism today. So it's after Marx dies that I think that differentiation of socialism and communism begins to gain ground in a way. And I think I was interested in pursuing that. And so the first point of call, and I'm doing a kind of quick appraisal of the roundabout way socialism and communism have kind of acted the way separately out during the course of history. And if you look at the around the time of the Second International, when you know, the heyday of the Second International, which coincided with with a large industrial boom during the period 1875 to 95, development of cartels and trusts and banking and industry, the rapid concentration of capital and a rapid increase in the productive power of labour, and the role, you know, the more direct role in the state, all the kind of things that Engels spoke about in his Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. And in this era, we have the development of the Second International. And I suppose I would say that history hasn't been kind to the Second International. And during the period of the Second International, then communism was effectively dropped. And so we had the movement towards socialism in the Second International. So Second International, the various national social democratic parties effectively replaced communism with socialism in their version of the transition from capitalism. As a broad share of mass parties, as we know the Second International was, they exhibited different tendencies, anarchist, Marxist and reformist. And Marxist theories of revolution premised on workers' power, self-emancipation, and the revolution of politics, social republic, leading to socialism based on associated producers, was contradicted by practices of social reformism and their emphasis on the state as a means of pursuing the transition in a more orderly form, democratic republicanism, and onto something called socialist republicanism. So the transition from capitalism to socialism was more often broached in terms of an orderly path to workers' power. Workers represented by Socialist Party, the Socialist Party, within the German SDP, which kind of expressed these tendencies, more anarchic Marxist and reformist, battling away within a kind of a mass German Social Democratic Party. Then, we know the situation that Kautsky laid claim to Marxist theory and in a way sort of hold the reins of Marxist theory and develop that and try to push the party in its policies, in the way it practiced the policies, in the way it developed the working class through education and cultural aspects of life within the SPD. He tries to hold the reins there, but other forces, I would argue, cutting the whole thing pretty rapidly because we've got to move on. Which are epitomized by Bernstein provided the theory to practice a gradual reform towards socialism. And in time, I think history obviously shows this, reformist arguments gained the upper hand and dominated the SDP in terms of its practice, if not its theory. And I think that's one of the criticisms of Kautsky, that he was good on theory, but less consistent in the way that was practiced within the party towards building workers' self-emancipation, workers' self-consciousness, confidence in acting to take power. And too much was left to a kind of gradual approach by the state, which the SDP sought to control. And that was reflected in lots of national socialist parties in Second International, including the Labour Party, the foregoers of the Labour Party. So thereafter, the national focus of gradual socialism and the pivotal role of the state had a decisive role in limiting the nurturing of working class consciousness, and proved to be instrumental in limiting the development of a revolutionary practice within the working class. All of which offer the context for what eventually transpired, which is a politics of betrayal, manifested in war credits and setting workers against each other in imperialist war. Lenin famously put this down to the developments in society of imperialism and an opportunism that developed not just within parties like the SDP, but also within the working class itself. And other people reflect on maybe the composition, the class composition of the SDP and some of the second international parties, and whether there was not a shift towards a higher proportion of representation of middle class professionals, along with what then would have called the Labour aristocracy. And this is all kind of like leading the trend within the party. So and there's lots more to that. But the diluting of policy, SDP policy, went on in post-war terms. In the Weimar Republic, 1919, we see that Hilferding continued the reformist trajectory of the German SPD in terms of completing the kind of a democratization of the state and the economy, and really socialism was effectively diluted to seeking a balance between capital and labour and decision making, with capitalist exploitation of labour as a bedrock. So Hilferding famously angled his policies towards industrial democracy, but it wasn't so much to get rid of the bourgeoisie and put the workers in power, but to provide workers with equal rights in industry, in the organisations of corporations they worked in. Not really so far removed from what happened in Britain in the 70s with the movement to democratise some of the corporations which failed. But nevertheless, that movement at the peak of labourism took workers on the board of directors to have more of a say in the run of the factories and so on. So the war slowed them down. And obviously tied into this was like a theory of a Marxist theory of capitalist political economy, which hinged around in the early days a kind of underconsumptionism, which became more intense as labour power effectively became more powerful in producing mass-produced goods that needed to be consumed by a working class that wasn't capable of consuming it. And this kind of cycle goes on through crisis, building up kind of a crisis of realization of profits. And that was the heart of it. If you look at the airfare program, that points out that that is the central cause of crisis for as far as health was concerned. And Hilferding later on with his famous work on finance capital, which situates the crisis there, but also in a crisis of a disequilibrium between branches of production, between the branches that produce capital and branches that produce finished consumer goods. And there's a breakdown there. Anyway, so here then, the bottom line is that we move away from communism, and it's the language of socialism, it's the language of reform. It's situated with the state socialism, if you like, and it's premised within a national framework. So on we go to the Russian Revolution and a further defamation of socialism. So overlapping with the events in Germany, the Russian Revolution put communism back on the agenda, only for the eventual counter-revolution, Stalinism, which opened up further differences between socialism and communism. So the Bolshevik position from Lenin's State of Revolution was that socialism was the transitional period to communism. Socialism being the initial phase towards the developed phases of communism. The idea was that under workers' power, the state would be stripped of political power, maintaining administrative functions and eventually withering away, as we know. And also tied into that was like the very crucial role for Lenin of the Soviets, which, as we also know, became a kind of hollowed out husk during the course of the revolution for a whole set of reasons. The failure of European revolutions could not rescue the Russian Revolution. It was engulfed by civil war, imperialist war, and internal political struggles with the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries left and right. The productive forces went into reverse gear. The force of production in Russia were kind of centralized, and that kind of gave a hope that we could use that centralization with a bit, most of the working class were to form the basis, the springboard for a revolution, taking peasants with them. But that level of forced production was retarded relative to the more developed parts of Europe in Britain and Germany and France. But nevertheless, even that level of forced production went in reverse gear. So there was a lurch from socialist transition, from transmogrified, if you like, into war communism, and the lurch into the NEP, which is the use of the mixed economy to try and overcome the kind of scissors crisis, if you like, between what the urban working class could produce for peasants in a way of machinery and tools, which they couldn't, and the willingness of the peasantry to give up surplus labour, and the poor productivity as well of agricultural production. So all this would be kind of like back into each other, as we know. And Stalin put an end to the chaos by forced collectivization under an authoritarian state. And socialism could now be reframed as socialism in one country, with communism a distant fiction. So And then we move on to Stalinism exporting that kind of socialism in one country, based on the bureaucratic control of the state to Eastern Europe, of course, and through the Comintern, it helps to revitalise social democracy around the rest of capitalist Europe. And so, the Marshall Plan, US aid, financial aid, plus in combination with the eventual Cold War politics, helps to ensure that social democratic expressions of socialism, like Labourism in the UK, facilitated conditions for renewed accumulation of capital to underpin the post-1945 boom, while taking large swathes of production out of the market, out of the value form, out of capital sphere. So social democracy in its most developed form, and I would say that, and I pointed out that I've done a PhD on Labourism in Britain, and the argument that I put forward there is that social democracy fused with the influence of Stalinism in terms of planning, and social democracies turn towards Keynesianism, using money, fiscal and monetary policy to kind of regulate the market. So, the law of value, if you like, in certain areas. Those two came together to produce Labourism, which underpinned the social democratic boom. And so this kind of like midway, if you like, transitional form favoured capital because it produced the post-war boom. But nevertheless, it was based too on the proliferation of use values in all the ways that we know. So nationalisation of energy, of housing, education, and healthcare, and also the development of a social wage, which kind of cut into the cash nexus. This idea that workers under capitalism must be governed by commodity fascism, governed by the reserve army labour status, governed by the cash nexus to sell the labour power. Well, under social democracy, as it transpired in the UK, and that was partially broken. So we had the partial suspension of labour's condition as variable capital, if you like, within the accumulation process. And this is extended by the social welfare state, the provision of benefits, universal benefits, and the way money was kind of partially decommodified. So some of the state money goes to capital to kind of, to spur growth in post-war, but a lot of money is transferred as non-capitalist money into the public sector and into creating jobs and into creating internal markets within corporations, within the public sector, that made it difficult to hire and fire. So again, these kind of things are like, in a way, the market and the plan, partial suspension of capitalism, very unstable, didn't last long. And for me, this is like another deformation of socialism without any thought that there is communism. Forget about communism. This is socialism. It was accepted that way. So, anyway, in the its most developed form, social democracy offered a twisted and perverse form. Socialism, premised on control of money capital in the way it's described, and the terms and conditions of the sale of labour power. Could also add the industrial relations system that's popped up then as well. Trade union growth, industrial relations, the management of labour and capital relations through the industrial relations structure, which went into fixing prices and incomes policies. Again, fixing the price of labour in conscious ways instead of letting the market do it. So, you know, in all these and more that you could talk about. So we know the story. We don't live in classic conditions of social democracy now. So with the decline of social democracy, then we see emerge capital getting the freeing off of capital, finance capital, because within the old arrangements of the socialism, then capital's convertibility, you know, sterling's convertibility was kind of constrained for a long period, and finance capital was encouraged to invest in industry and oversee both the public sector and also the private sector. So if you look on like the rail boards, then you see big capitalist interests who are involved in the national railway to price the running of the railway system, the rail track, the the stock, the engines and carriages and labour, and cost it in terms favourable to capital, and same with the energy structure. Because it wasn't there to make a profit, then it was there to produce in a cost-effective way as possible, so capital could take advantage of that in private capital. So anyway, all that has gone today, and I need to move on right now. So the story is that we see the collapse, obviously, of social democracy, and we could say that's the end of the influence of socialism, and it opens up opportunities today to kind of like let us all think about the relationship as Marxists between socialism and communism, put it back on the agenda and again, and think about like socialist transformation, communism, issues of democracy, how we achieve that, how we achieve the emancipation of the working class, raising the consciousness of the working class to to take up the historic mission, our historic mission to communism. But without talking too much about neoliberalism, which you can come back to, we still live today with socialism, and in terms of deformed forms of socialism existing with communist parties in power around the world, most notably in China, obviously North Korea, Cuba, different versions, different cultural manifestations, but the same thing. The kind of socialism which exploits workers and controls workers, and cuts off access to communism, puts it on the agenda. So far on the agenda, it might as well be in the Never Never Land, and that's the way the communist parties that are in power and their bureaucratic edifice that run the state, the apparatchiks, that's the way they determine the direction of those countries. So behind this thin ideological veil of claims about a socialist transition, there's the difference between socialism and communism takes on the incoherent form of a quasi-modes of production, ossified under the bureaucratic dictatorship of the communist parties, claiming to be the vanguard of working class. I'm not for 1 minute saying that we go along with that, or even the Chinese working class, or the Cuban, Korean, but yet they don't have much kind of capacity to overturn the situation, and so they live with it and they are exploited. We have a kind of macabre world in which socialism becomes a social Frankenstein of authoritarian bureaucracy, to exist over many decades, even centuries, with twists and turns along the way towards the never reached land of communism, which becomes a little bit like an unpaid promissory note to the working class. You pick up the bill in terms of being exploited year on year. So the Communist Party of China sell this ideology to the masses of workers and peasants as they pursue a long and twisted belt and bridges road towards retrenchment with global capitalism. And the mode of production, ostensibly socialism, which is supposed to be a transition, but some weird form of mode of production, is one of super exploitation of Chinese workers and peasants' labour power. It's both capitalist and the imperial West. This is where neoliberalism comes in, free finance capital, free offshore and deindustrialisation of the West, which is enjoyed by the imperialist West, who invest for direct investments into China, as well as homegrown capitalists in China to compete with each other to exploit Chinese labour power. Drawing on Engels and that pamphlet again, we might say our world is one that has shifted from utopian socialism to scientific socialism to forms of dystopian socialism. Incidentally, Marx also drew our attention to capitalist ascendancy and decline. I mentioned this, the aspect of decline just before. I believe, like the Communist Party of Great Britain, have a theory of decline, capitalist decline. Am I right? Or yeah, great. So speaking the same language, by which Marx meant the decline of the value form as a means of harnessing the vast social wealth that our labour power produces for capital. So capitalism reaches an ascendancy in the pursuit of our labour power, extraction of surplus value, but also reaches a point of decline, and both intermingle with each other. It's not like a nice, neat linear process, because politics play a part, defeat of the working class, partial victories, mostly defeats. And we see that there's a kind of like a complex symbiosis between ascendancy and decline. I think Lenin picked this out in terms of his imperialism, the highest point of capitalism, in which he mentioned retardation factors in capitalism, not just to do with like parasitism, coupon clipping, but the fact that capitalism in its monopoly phase, in its phase where large corporations control the whole industry and the smaller firms in it, began to dictate price, profits, and slow down the rate of growth of technology, and so slow down the organic composition of capital, which Marx talked about in terms of being deadly to the fall in the rate of profit. So there's a tendency there to slow down the force of production. And Lenin spoke of all those things in his imperialism, the highest state of capitalism. And he was talking about that, like that dialectical overlap of an ascendant capitalism and a declining capitalism. And Marx would not be surprised to find that global capital today reveals the tectonic plates of this contradiction. And with respect to the role played by such corrupt forms of socialism, it's interesting to know the polar worlds of US imperialism and Chinese forms of capitalism, or as they call it, the socialism with Chinese characteristics in the present era. So, so we see with the biggest imperial power, the US, it's immensely powerful, imperial, politically, militarily, but it also shows evidence of parasitism, of financial parasitism, of the control of large swathes of the productive capital by finance capital, and it's internalized that. Yeah, this is something Pilfering pointed out. It's not so much that banking controls industry we should free it off, and then the industry will be okay. But there's been a colonization of productive capital, and now it's in its highest form in America. And we see finance capital in the form of, you know, the big capitalists like BlackRock and other major mutual funds and pension funds. They own large swathes. They own major shares in large swathes of capital from the war industry, you know, Lockheed and so on. And they kind of lean towards, and through the hunt, through shareholder pressure indirectly, and by the fact that the people who control these companies, because these are vast shares, and you don't own all the shares, that's for sure. The shares are sucked up worldwide and presented to these mutual companies who have a control and influence, and they're the finance capitalists. And what they do is redirect surplus value away from back into investment and towards the stock market, to build a stock market price, to have bets on the futures market and the bond market and the currency market and so on. And so there's a tendency to pull capital away from production, as you know, and use that surplus value to gamble with and not reinvest. And there is a tension going on because large swathes of like productive capital bank up surplus capital so that so they can survive, because the stock market and hedging funds and all the rest of it kind of like a very unstable way to invest your surplus value because of the speculations and so on. So that's, I began by saying that's one end of the world, and on the other side of the world we have China, which appears to utilize aspects of social democracy, Stalinism, and neoliberalism to achieve rapid acceleration, forced production, and capital accumulation. So in a way, that kind of decline of value, that ascendancy and decline, is kind of expressing itself through these two rivals. And on the one side, China is using socialism, deformed forms of socialism, through the state to manage and direct where capital goes. Yes, there's large swathes of capital. 70-odd%, 80% of China is capitalist with private owners. Large swathes are still 30% are social enterprises, and they've changed too, because there's no longer guaranteed employment, there's no longer the iron rice bowls they used to call them. People have to fend for themselves, they can hide and fired, and there's market mechanisms there, but the state take control and influence in the private sector and in the state sector, and they use that influence to control and manage capital accumulation in ways that can be directed towards technological innovation, the development of science, and applied to production. And so, in a funny old way, we have to rely on deformed, or capital has to rely, in this day and age, on deformed sources of forms of socialism to generate growth. And without that, it becomes parasitic. At least that's the way I'm reading it. It's no big deal to read it that way. Most people can't see that. So I suppose the core message is that such national entities within a decline of global capitalism require a grotesque combination of distorted form of socialism, finance capital, orchestrated by dystopic authoritarian state socialism to, it's a bit of a mouthful, secure regimes of capital expansion and slow down capitalist decline. Great. I was going to talk about, in light of what I've said, CPGB program. So, but I've maybe been better off in the discussion. Okay. Just in light of that, dialectic, if you like, between socialism and communism, which I'm not hostile to with CPGB. I think there needs to be a transition. But it might, I think where I kind of get confused, I could be maybe like naive, is where democratic republicanism, social republicanism comes in. Because it seems to me it's a two-stage approach. I might get it wrong. Maybe I should attend more of these meetings perhaps and get it right. I don't know. Maybe. But I feel that somehow the working class are kind of like, I don't know, somewhat second in order in terms of the development of the self-emancipation of the working class, but the democratic struggle. So I'd like to be put right on that, but it also has sort of about the programme.
Thank you, Peter. Bob,
Okay, Peter, thanks for your opening. One quick comment, and a couple of questions from me that goes with that. First of all, the question of utopian socialism, which you spoke about towards the beginning of this